the fun part. We get to see how the development community takes advantage of that feature set.
Something's happening with video game consoles. They've changed from machines people couldn't wait to get their hands on to machines people couldn't wait to forget. And after weeks of digging, I boiled down every problem the 9th generation has down to 3. So let's break them down, starting with the most obvious of them all, the games.
Okay, this video really pissed me off.
Where are the games at?
Where are the games?
Where are the games?
It's dry. Where are the games?
I kind of keep waiting.
I'm sure many of you already know who he is, but the problem I have is not so much with him, but the premise with which he uses to present his video. There's obviously a popular sentiment amongst gamers and streamers surrounding the 9th generation of consoles. Numerous problems have been cited with the way they release with buggy software, and also with the way their games seem to come out unfinished, and then just the fact that there seem to be not that many of them. This is obviously used as one of 3 examples illustrating the problem with the current generation of consoles. And my problem is not so much with the problems as they are presented, but rather with the arguments used to justify these claims. He suggests on several occasions that we should all just dispense with the consoles and just migrate over to PC. He does this without making it clear to his audience that the PC has been suffering from the same problems for a far longer period of time. He is probably being hyperbolic more than anything else, but it is nevertheless a lie of omission. And so I have taken it upon myself to set the record straight, and also explain the reason why these problems have manifested in the games industry.
60, that's your message?
Each one defined a specific part of my life, and I'm pretty sure it did for you guys too. But the honest truth is that the 9th generation consoles are just overpriced, poor gaming experiences, where the games are held back by less capable machines, corporate greed, and a censored online environment in a world where if I spend a couple extra $100, I get all of that and more on a PC. The market is basically being forced to go elsewhere.
This is, of course, not an obvious truth. This is an oversimplified half-truth. The real truth is that Moore's Law is dead. Game development is so time-consuming and so expensive that it has effectively slowed to a crawl. Corporate greed is not what people think it is in the industry, and the consoles are actually an excellent value for the money. Let me elaborate. In order to get something superior to your console, you have to buy a graphics card that is at least the cost of the console, if not $100 cheaper, but often going more expensive than the cost of the console on just the graphics card alone is the safest option. What this means is you will likely be spending triple the price of a console to get something that is truly superior in quality. It is true that the ability to just plug in and play is a thing of the past, but that was a thing of the past on a PC, long before it was a thing of the past on the consoles. I mean, all the issues that he cites with the consoles, like the fact that you need to constantly load a patch or install your game. The PC was installing games all the way back in the 95 days. I remember getting a copy of Command & Conquer Red Alert and needing to install both discs, and then switch between the discs to play the game. And while the need to switch between discs disappeared with the arrival of the DVD, it didn't change the fact that I had to install the game. And the installation of patches was minimal and unobtrusive, but that changed with the arrival of services like Steam, and especially with things like the Epic Game Store. Has anyone ever tried downloading Fortnite on the Epic Game Store? It's a monumental task, and it takes a lot of patience. In fact, those 30 gigabyte plus patches that he says he has to put up with on the consoles, that happens on the Epic Game Store. It happens when you want to play games like Fortnite. Oh, and by the way, Fortnite doesn't actually play all that well on a PC. If you want to actually get that superior experience you claim exists, you have to deal with shader compilation stutter everywhere. Fortunately, once you've actually experienced this, it eventually goes away and you don't have to deal with it again. But if you ever have to reinstall your game and the shaders have to recompile, say your prayers. By the way, this is a problem with numerous other games that run on Unreal Engine, and only a handful of games don't have this problem. Hellblade is one of them, Returnal is another. The idea that playing on a PC has all these quality of life improvements compared to a console is just garbage. In fact, if you look at the backwards compatibility situation, it's more complicated and requires a lot of troubleshooting, especially if you want to play a game that is older than the PS3 and Xbox 360 era. Most of those games have compatibility issues with later versions of Windows. They will usually not load or exhibit graphical artifacts that cannot be explained, and someone who went through the trouble of trying to fix it themselves will usually be happy enough to post on a forum, and if you look far enough, you might find that answer in a week. I'll give you one very real-world example of how this is a problem even on the 360 generation. I decided to load up my old copy of Assassin's Creed because I was curious to play it. All the new Assassin's Creed seemed boring to me, and I wanted to experience that original game for what it was at the time, dripping with atmosphere and full of ambiance. Well, guess what I found? The game stutters spontaneously every minute or so, and I eventually found out the reason why too. Apparently the game had a DRM function that allowed whatever game you were playing to phone home to one of Ubisoft's servers. If you disconnect from the internet, it turns off and doesn't function. But for anyone who doesn't want to disconnect from the internet, they have to make manual adjustments to the script of the game in order to make sure that server ping doesn't actually phone home anymore. And the reason why it pauses is because it's not able to actually connect with that server. It's been disconnected for years. This is just one of the numerous ways the PC has added baggage that is constantly getting in the way of a smooth experience. But PC gamers historically have been happy to put up with all of these weird troubleshooting issues, and the resources are there for people who are willing to look for them, but for people who just want to play their games, unless you're playing games that have been supported consistently for years and years and years, like Overwatch or Team Fortress 2, chances are you are going to encounter some of these troubleshooting issues, especially if you want to play older games, whereas if you try on the console, this just does not exist. But to be fair, at least you can play these older games on your PC, whereas on the console, you have a limited library of games that have been manually given support by their developers to actually appear on the later Xbox. The PS5 only goes as far back as the previous generation, the PS4 generation, and that's a bit disappointing. If we're being really honest, the fact that you have to go to such great lengths to get the experience you want on a PC, as time goes on, as the platform becomes overrun with baggage and legacy code that is no longer supported, chances are you're going to want to play on the console and avoid all this altogether. This obviously does not affect games like Overwatch or Destiny or Team Fortress 2, or heck, maybe even Fallout 3, but even Fallout 3 has had its share of problems moving beyond Windows 7. Playing on Windows 10 and Windows 11 has seen its share of crashing issues. Crashing issues that had no obvious solution, at least the last time I tried to play. And all that business about networking and communication being what it is on the PC, that was sort of an inevitability if you really think about it. All that integrated work for the consoles required a lot of individual input from the game developers in order to get working. And even then, the smartphone revolution was right around the corner, waiting to take its place. And oh boy did it succeed, and oh boy did it replace most of the things we did with computers in a matter of years. Many people today don't even have a PC. They just do things on their phone. In fact, the whole argument he makes about consoles could equally be made of PCs. What's the point of having a PC if you can do everything you need on your phone? The simple answer is obvious. Play graphically demanding games with incredibly high graphical effects, but all of those games with graphical effects would not exist on PC without the console. The last time anyone tried to release a very graphically demanding game on the PC by itself was with the release of the original Crysis back in 2007, alongside all those other games he lists that were incredible for their time. And this cannot be understated about the legacy of Crysis. For every copy of the game that was sold, 19 more were stolen, pirated from the internet, and just played without giving any sort of money to the developers. That should give you an idea of what the gaming landscape was like. He suggests that PC porting just wasn't a thing, but that is not true either. Loads of games, like Far Cry 2, like Crysis 2, like Assassin's Creed, like The Prince of Persia, like Gears of War, like Halo 2, like Mass Effect, All those games received PC ports, and almost all of them had graphical features that made them superior to their console counterparts, even if some of them had issues. And even though PC ports were a thing in the 360 generation, you didn't see all that many implementations of DirectX 11 games when the feature set became available to developers with the release of Windows 7. Part of the reason for this is that the console landscape was the only place you could reasonably expect to make your money back as a game developer. The rise of platforms like Steam was beginning to pick up, but even then it wasn't clear that it was going to be a substantial way of protecting your game license. Anyone who had made big investments in the PC in the past were all of a sudden forced to move to consoles as a way of trying to recoup their losses for being truly ambitious and innovative on the old platform. It's important to remember that most game developers work with the lowest common denominator, path of least resistance style of thinking when it comes to game development. And for a while, that was the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. That's why all their PC ports were essentially just muscular versions of the consoles, with DX9 feature sets instead of DX11. It is true that games like Far Cry 3 and Crysis 3 did have DX11 support, but these were very exceptional cases. Widespread support for the DX11 feature set would not catch on until the release of the PlayStation 4. So, for anyone who is trying to bash the consoles, let's make one thing abundantly clear. Without the consoles, we would not be enjoying the PC gaming renaissance we saw in 2013 and 2014. And by the way, that renaissance has persisted since those years have passed. And again, guess what has driven the use of most of the features that are present on the PC graphics cards? It's the consoles. Sure, there were a few games that used ray tracing because Nvidia paid them to put ray tracing in their games, but if you look at all the other features that really make a difference, they made their debut on the consoles. Take for instance Unreal Engine 5 with Nanite, and then Lumen. Lumen is kind of an interesting case because it sort of made the developments with real-time ray tracing, hardware-based ray tracing, a bit superfluous, and less relevant than it probably would have been otherwise. Which isn't to say that the consoles are incapable of supporting that feature set. The consoles are what has driven most of the graphics features that we enjoy in PC gaming today, like mesh shading, like variable rate shading, like Nanite, like Lumen. But of course there is a justifiable frustration in the fact that it has taken 4 years for all of this to unfold, whereas maybe it took 1 or 2 after the release of the PlayStation 4 for things like tessellation to catch on. But there's a reason for that as well that nobody really wants to talk about. Several, actually. The first of which is the overwhelming expense of video games. God of War Ragnarok itself cost $212 million. Spider-Man 2 cost $300 million to make. Back in the days of the PS3 and the Xbox 360, publishers needed to sell at least 1 million copies of a game to turn a profit. It's obvious now that that problem has increased exponentially, and that doesn't even touch the issue with manpower required in order to make these games. Yes, I'm going to say game development is hard, and I'm not going to let anyone point to the 7th generation and what was accomplished there as a way of trying to point to what is happening now as though it is comparable. It isn't. If you look at the processors in the PlayStation 3, meaning the RSX chip and the Cell Broadband engine, both of those chips together combine to make about 538 million transistors. The APU in the PlayStation 4 was upwards of 5 billion, and the PlayStation 5 was obviously higher than that. The idea that people should be able to get the same amount of work done when they are dealing with an order of magnitude more complexity is absurd. Not only is it absurd, it is asinine. And also, knowing how to program doesn't give you a clue of how hard it is to make a game. I'm going to borrow the words of Tim Kaine when I say this. Unless you have actually worked on a game commercially and seen it through to completion, you do not know what it is like to make a game. Mods do not count. Anything that you do in your spare time as a hobby project does not count. This also leads me into the next phase of my discussion, which involves crunch. The games industry is riddled with it, and it is one of the largest reasons why game development has slowed to a crawl. during the PlayStation 5 generation. It's important to remember most of these guys got their start in the early 2000s. They were young men, they were ambitious, they had dreams they wanted to make come true, and they actually had the means to do so. In a lot of cases, they did. As they got older, though, the ability for them to push themselves and show immense dedication to their craft became more limited. But the demands of the game industry continued to grow, even though their ability to meet those demands became increasingly depleted. Joshua Sawyer discusses the topic in greater detail, and he defines crunch as
60 or more hours a week for more than 8 weeks. That might be a little more generous. Some people might say 50 hours for 6 weeks or more. When you have people work longer than this, for longer than this, meaning for more hours and for a longer period of time than this, your productivity actually goes down.
a work regimen that would kill most people and give others heart attacks. In fact, Joshua Sawyer actually shared stories where several people were told by their doctor, you need to quit your job or you're going to have a heart attack. But that doesn't change the fact that most gamers aren't really aware of all this work. They're aware that their game developers work hard, but they're not aware that they very frequently give blood and lose sleep over their job in order to make their customers happy. Also, gratitude has a very short half-life, and it's not long after you finish the game where you expect the next experience to be much, much better than the first. And many of these guys fall apart under the pressure. Anyone remember that moment from the making of God of War 4 where Cory Barlog looks at the reviews for the game and he breaks down crying? Yeah, I would probably do the same in his position. So let me reiterate very clearly. Not only are game developers doing hard work, they are doing the impossible. So yes, game development is hard. When you take all of this into consideration, it means you cannot simply dispense with the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One in order to move on with the PlayStation 5. As much as we would like to, they're here to stay, at least for a few more years. And that was very much the case with the PlayStation 3 as well. The PlayStation 3 stuck around, even though most of the big publishers had already moved on to the next platform. There was still money to be made there. And when you consider all the costs and limitations imposed upon these guys by the COVID lockdowns, it would be stupid not to continue to appeal to that market. It cannot be overstated how much the pandemic lockdowns affected the game developers' ability to deliver their product. So much of the workflow that you rely upon when you are in an office, surrounded by your team, and relying upon those team dynamics and that in-person communication, now all of a sudden you have to pause for a week as you get situated in your house with a new workstation to work remotely. And on top of that, it's very clear that the lockdown measures exacerbated a lot of the problems that were already becoming acute in the gaming industry. All these added expenses, in addition to all these interruptions in workflow, were what encouraged the publishers to continue to support the PS4 and the Xbox One, because they just couldn't afford not to sell their games to people who had not bought the 9th generation consoles yet. Also, earlier in the video I mentioned how Moore's Law is dead. This might feel a bit out of place because we're talking about games and not the hardware that is designed to run those games. But when you consider how games were made to run with a specific feature set in mind that those chips were designed to support, it ultimately becomes important for the overall value proposition of the consoles. See, Sony used to sell all of their consoles at a loss. In other words, they would sell their consoles for cheaper than it cost to manufacture them. The reason they did this was because they knew that initial influx of purchases of their game console would eventually lead to software sales in the form of games, and those game sales would ultimately overcome the money lost on the sale of the game console. Later in the generation, as the chips that powered the consoles became more compact and cheaper to manufacture, Sony would still be able to drop the price of their console while also making their money back, substantially more money than they lost on their initial launch sales. The reason why they could do this was because the size of integrated circuits would continue to shrink, allowing them to continue to manufacture the same product with half the cost. In 2013, though, Bob Caldwell gave a talk at Hot Chips, where he talked about the challenges that microprocessor manufacturers would have to deal with as they pressed on towards the end, which he predicted would come in 2020. By the way, it's 2024, and when you consider the fact that Ampere was the last NVIDIA generation of GPUs to offer substantial performance improvements at very minimal increase in costs, it's hard to deny that he knew what he was talking about. But guess what devices released the same year as NVIDIA's Ampere GPUs? The PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. Technically, it's still possible to increase the number of transistors you have on a chip. You just have to do it at great expense. As the manufacturing process becomes substantially more complex and substantially more involved, causing the cost of any perceived performance improvements to skyrocket. It makes it much more difficult for the manufacturers of the consoles to continue to reduce their costs enough to make their money back. But then when you take that inability to reduce their manufacturing costs and combine it with the fact that they've had the worst inflation in almost 50 years, it makes sense why they would also struggle to release the games that would aid the success of their platform. When you take all of that into consideration with how inflation still exists, and is depleting the average consumer's ability to buy a product, in addition to a company's ability to recoup their losses, it makes perfect sense why all of these problems are occurring. In fact, the real problem with the 9th generation of consoles has less to do with the games and more to do with the economy as a whole. The real problem with the 9th generation of consoles has more to do with the fact that the economy around the world is just doing poorly, and consumers just don't have the money to buy the products they want. It's not just because the games aren't there, because obviously the games are there, even if they are in fewer numbers than they have been in prior generations. Again, this is a result of the fact that rising development costs have limited the number of projects companies can work on at any given time. It's very disappointing when people can't tell the difference between corporate greed and basic economics. Also, it's kind of funny that he points to the GameCube clip here of the machine turning on when the GameCube sold poorly compared to the PlayStation 2 during the 7th generation of consoles. Now, let me be clear. I am not trying to bash this guy. He obviously made this video for a reason. A lot of people have a lot of problems with the way the gaming landscape looks in 2024. It's really disappointing to see legends of the industry, like Naughty Dog, getting trapped by the process of endlessly remaking their games rather than making new ones. Prior to the release of God of War 3 in 2009, we were starting to see the move towards refreshes and remasterings of old games, but it still had not become a cornerstone of the industry. And we certainly didn't see remakes of games like we see now. I think the really important thing to remember about what he and the others in the audience are saying is not so much where are the games at, but rather where are those unique, compelling new experiences we used to get. We hardly get any games anymore that are not either a sequel, or a remake, or a remaster. So let's revisit the question at the beginning of the video. Where are the games at? And the real answer is ultimately a bit disappointing. It's indisputable that Sony no longer has that unique identity that it established itself with in the days of the original PlayStation, and the PlayStation 2. Those games that were sometimes unique and quirky and weird, but also very, very fun, and those art-driven pieces that stood alongside the AAA games, are nowhere to be seen. And I think the deeper reason for why the games industry has transformed the way it has ultimately has something to do with what George Lucas mentioned in his old interview about the creation of the Star Wars saga.
In the late 60s, the Warners, the Xanax, all the people that started the studios in the first place were retiring, and they were selling the studios to corporations. They were beverage companies and all kinds of they were in other businesses. They didn't know at all how to run a movie studio. All they know is if the marketing department said people want to see this, then you make that.
That explains it very perfectly. These people aren't craftsmen, they're accountants. And accountants don't understand the process of making art or storytelling, even if they can appreciate storytelling or art by itself. They are ultimately unable to replicate the non-mathematical, non-scientific process of creating art, of creating something that people will truly, ultimately appreciate. The only thing they understand is what sells, and if it doesn't sell, it doesn't get funding. That is why the creation of Halo clones were ultimately ubiquitous in the games industry before the release of Call of Duty 4, and then all of a sudden everyone tried to emulate the multiplayer style of Call of Duty 4. The reason why Halo and Call of Duty were the games to emulate for their era was because they sold the best, and an accountant will always prefer a safe bet to a risk. And it's very easy to see why they wanted to emulate Fortnite once it became clear that Fortnite was the best-selling property in video games. And then once Call of Duty was no longer the king, Fortnite was king. And you begin to see Call of Duty begin to emulate Fortnite's characteristics and incorporate it into their game. Again, when you see how expensive these games are to make, it makes perfect sense for these men to want to put their money on what they consider a safe, lucrative bet. They put in as much stuff as they possibly can to copy as many features that people like from other games as possible in order to hopefully appeal to as many potential customers as possible. But anyone who has read Aesop's Fables will understand one very fundamental truth about human nature. Trying to please everyone will please no one. People ultimately don't want games that are a little bit of everything, but nothing of itself. People don't want to play games that are a little bit like every other game, but ultimately having none of its own identity, none of its own unique characteristics that make it unique and appealing and capable of compelling them to not pay attention to other things. George Lucas's word about Hollywood and corporate filmmaking are easily applicable to the games industry. It's fallen into the same trap of trying to make more of the same thing, trying to keep the cow milked as long as possible, rather than actually coming up with new stories to tell. When you take this into consideration with how expensive game development is, how hard game development is, and how incredibly overworked game developers are, and how many of these developers eventually get burnt out and leave the industry, taking with them their institutional knowledge and their ability to get work done quickly, and the way the pandemic lockdowns and inflation have exacerbated these already monumental problems, it's beginning to look like the games industry is on its way to collapse. And maybe, just maybe, that is what the games industry needs. Maybe what the games industry really needs is for the current business models and corporate institutions to collapse and disappear, so that game development can return to its roots. It's really disappointing to see companies like Sony that had a reputation as being a family of developers all working together towards one great gaming experience choose to close down so many of its smaller studios, to the point where the variety that it promised players for 4 whole generations is no longer possible. Just like in Hollywood, more and more money is going to fund fewer and fewer projects. You would think they would not fall victim to the same sort of traps that other developers do. And as the video I'm referring to suggests, for some reason Insomniac has managed to avoid the sort of development problems that so many other developers have suffered. 3 games in a matter of 4 years. I miss the days when that was the case for their familiars like Sony Santa Monica, and Naughty Dog, and Guerrilla Games. We can hope that the other developers eventually adopt Insomniac's strategy for making video games and try to emulate it. But it's more likely the case that they will try to do things the way they've always done, with ever-increasing budgets and ever-increasing manpower. And while it may be true that games consoles as a device we play in our living room will eventually go away, it's probably not going to happen soon, especially as developers learn to adjust to the high inflation and regain their steam from the lockdown measures. Regardless of what happens to the consoles, one thing remains abundantly clear. The PC as a platform will not save the games industry from consolidating itself to eventually disappearing. It is true that the PC platform can rely upon things like crowdfunding and indie game development to fuel its efforts, but the ability to succeed requires the ability to market yourself incredibly well. And the biggest problem with indie developers is getting noticed in the first place. The number of indie games that actually get noticed and see success is incredibly small, even though the amount of money needed to guarantee success is a lot lower. Also, let's not kid ourselves. A lot of the better games on the PC that we are seeing today began as console exclusives, or at the very least developed on both consoles first, before being ported over. Even with the influx of DRM and publisher-imposed controls preventing people from engaging in piracy, there is still a general distrust amongst game developers towards the PC platform. Perhaps this means there will be at least one more console generation, a 10th generation of consoles. But who knows what the future holds after this? And who knows whether or not the PC gaming ecosystem will be able to sustain itself once it no longer has the consoles propping it up.